I had just finished typing up Wolfe's correspondence 3 polite refusals to appear on radio programs. 1 acceptance of a shipment of Phalaenopsis schilleriana from Manila, a terse note to his accountant about the rising cost of fritzes. Truffle supply, when the doorbell rang at precisely 4:17 on a Thursday afternoon in October. This was unfortunate timing. Wolfe had descended from the plant rooms at 4 o'clock sharp, as he always did, and was settled in his oversized chair behind his desk with a bottle of beer and the latest issue of the Orchid Review. His routine was sacred, and interruptions during his reading hour were about as welcome as a rat in the kitchen. I went to the hall and peered through the one-way glass panel. Standing on the stoop was a woman in her early 40s, expensively dressed in a charcoal suit with a mink stole draped over her shoulders despite the mild weather. Her face had the kind of careful composition that suggested she'd spent the morning at a mirror rehearsing expressions. I opened the door. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice controlled but with a tremor underneath like ice cracking. "I need to see Nero Wolfe immediately. Do you have an appointment?" "No, but then Mr. Wolfe is unavailable. You can call tomorrow morning at 11 to arrange. I can't wait until tomorrow." Her gloved hands tightened on her purse. "My husband was murdered last night, and the police think I did it. I've heard variations on that theme before, and 9 times out of 10, it's genuine panic mixed with genuine guilt." But something about the way she said it, the precision of the words, the absence of tears made me pause. "What's your name, Mrs. Claudia Vance?" "My husband was Theodore Vance, the financier." I knew the name. Vance had been in the papers recently, something about a merger that had made a lot of people rich and a few people furious. I glanced back toward the office, weighing my options. Wolfe would be annoyed either way if I sent her away, he'd complain about lost income. If I let her in, he'd complain about the interruption. "Wait here," I said, and closed the door in the office. Wolfe was pouring his second glass of beer with the concentration of a chemist measuring reagents. He didn't look up. "And Mrs. Claudia Vance is on the stoop," I said. Her husband was Theodore Vance, the financier. He was murdered last night, and she claims the police suspect her. She wants to see you immediately. Wolfe's eyes didn't leave his magazine. "She's wearing mink in 60-degree weather. Irrelevant. She's probably good for a substantial retainer." "I am reading." I sat down at my desk and picked up a pencil. Tapping it against the blotter? "You know, it's funny. I was just thinking this morning how dull things have been lately. No interesting cases, no intellectual stimulation. It's just correspondence and beer and orchids. A man could grow stale." Wolfe's eyes rose from the page, and he gave me the look he reserves for occasions when I've said something particularly irritating, but not quite dismissible. "Furthermore," I continued, "I read about Vance in the Times last week, the Consolidated Dynamics merger. Very complicated financial maneuvering. Millions of dollars. The kind of case where motives get tangled up with greed, pride, and betrayal. The kind of puzzle you claim to find beneath your interest right up until you spend 3 days thinking about it." Wolfe closed the magazine. "Show her in," he said, "and bring another glass." I dislike drinking alone when a client is present. It suggests inhospitality. I grinned and went to fetch Mrs. Vance. She entered the office with the careful posture of someone walking across ice, eyes taking in the room, the globe, the bookshelves, the red leather chair, and finally Wolfe himself, a 1/7 of a ton of genius arranged behind a desk like a Buddha considering the folly of the world. "Mrs. Vance," Wolfe said without rising, "please sit. You'll take beer?" "No, thank you." She settled into the red chair, smoothing her skirt with mechanical precision. "I understand you're expensive, Mr. Wolfe. I am adequate to my worth, Archie. Your notebook." I flipped it open and waited. Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his middle expanse. "Proceed. Omit nothing relevant, but spare me sentiment." Mrs. Vance's jaw tightened slightly. She wasn't accustomed to being spoken to like a witness under examination, but she nodded. "My husband was found dead in his study at our home in Riverside Drive at 6:40 this morning. He'd been shot once. Through the heart. Gone was Minna. Small revolver I kept in my nightstand. The police say there were no signs of forced entry, and the household staff heard nothing unusual during the night. Who found the body? I did. Theodore often worked late in his study. I went down at 6:30 to speak with him and found him, slumped over his desk. What did you wish to speak with him about at such an hour? A flicker of something crossed her face, irritation maybe, or calculation. I wanted to discuss our plans for the weekend. We're supposed to attend a charity gala on Saturday. Wolfe's eyes half closed, a sign I recognized. He was already dissecting the logic of her statement, testing it for internal consistency. You discovered your husband's body at 6:40. You telephoned the police at what time? 6:42? Prompt? Where was the gun found? On the floor beside his chair. It'd been fired recently? Yes. One bullet was discharged. The police suspected because Mrs. Vance's composure finally cracked, just slightly. No, because I'm his wife. Because the gun was mine. Because we argued the day before about his business affairs. Because... She stopped. Continue, because I inherit everything. Theodore's estate is worth approximately $47 million. Wolfe opened his eyes fully and regarded her with something approaching interest. That, he said, is an adequate motive for murder. Or for suspicion of it. What precisely do you want from me, Mrs. Vance? I want you to prove I didn't kill my husband. No. Wolfe shook his head. I am not in the business of proving innocence. I investigate facts. If those facts demonstrate your innocence, well enough. If they do not, he left the sentence hanging like a noose. Then investigate, she said flatly. I didn't kill Theodore, Mr. Wolfe. Someone else did, and I want you to find out who. Wolfe was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. Then he looked at me. Archie, your impression. I'd been watching her the whole time, and I gave it to him straight. She's frightened but controlled. She's telling the truth about wanting us to investigate. But I'd bet my week's salary she's not telling the whole truth about everything else. Mrs. Vance's eyes snapped to me, sharp as glass. Wolfe nodded slowly, a retainer of $10,000. My fee will be determined upon completion of the investigation. If I conclude that you murdered your husband, I will so inform the police and return half the retainer. Acceptable? Yes, and we have an agreement. Archie, show Mrs. Vance out and obtain the necessary information: address, telephone number, names of household staff and business associates. Then call Saul and Fred. I'll want them available tomorrow. I stood and gestured to Mrs. Vance, who rose with the same careful control she'd shown throughout. As I walked her to the door, she turned to me in the hall. Does he always speak like that? She asked. Like what? Like a judge passing sentence. I grinned. That's just his warm-up. Wait until he really gets interested. Then he sounds like God correcting a mistake in creation. She didn't smile. After I'd collected her information and sent her on her way, I returned to the office. Had reopened the Orchid Review and appeared to be reading, but I knew better. So I said, settling at my desk. What do you think? I think Wolfe said, without looking up, that Mrs. Vance is lying about why she went to her husband's study. At 6:30 in the morning, I think the police are correct to suspect her. I think this case will prove to be considerably more intricate than a wife murdering her husband for money. Based on what? Based on the fact that she came to me at all. Guilty woman would either confess or hire a criminal lawyer, not a private investigator. Mrs. Vance wants us to find something. The question is whether she knows what that something is, or merely hopes we'll find it. He closed the magazine and reached for his beer. Call Inspector Kramer, he said. I'll invite him to join us tomorrow morning at 11. And tell Fritz we'll have 2 guests for lunch, assuming Kramer accepts. I dislike eating with strangers, but I tolerate police inspectors. What about dinner tonight? Sweetbreads and cream sauce with mushrooms. Why? Just checking that murder hasn't spoiled your appetite. Wolfe gave me a look that could have frozen. Beer mid-pour. Archie, he said, murder has never spoiled my appetite. It has only occasionally delayed it. Now stop chattering and make those calls. I grinned and reached for the phone. The game, as they say, was afoot. Inspector Kramer arrived at 10:55 the next morning. which meant he was either eager or irritated with Kramer. The two states often looked identical. Came into the office like a man walking into a room he'd been kicked out of too. Many times to count, his unlit cigar clamped between his teeth and his gray eyes already suspicious. "All right, Wolfe," he said, dropping into the red leather chair without waiting for an invitation. "What's your angle on the Vance case?" Wolfe, who had been reading the morning paper with his breakfast beer, set down his glass with deliberate care. "Good morning, Inspector. I have no angle, as you put it. I have a client who has retained my services, Claudia Vance. Correct? Then you're wasting your time and her money. We've got her cold." Kramer pulled a notebook from his pocket and flipped it open. Theodore Vance, shot through the heart with a .32 revolver registered to his wife. Time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. The only fingerprints on the gun are hers. The household staff cook, butler, and maid were all in their quarters on the third floor and heard nothing. Mrs. Vance claims she was asleep in her bedroom, which is conveniently on the opposite end of the second floor from her husband's study. Conveniently, Wolfe murmured. An interesting choice of word. What else would you call it? The woman had motive, 47 million reasons. She had means her own gun. She had opportunity. She was in the house all night. She's got no alibi worth a damn. Kramer's cigar shifted to the other side of his mouth. The DA is preparing charges. Probably arrest her by Monday. On such evidence, you'd convict? You're damn right we would. Wolfe's eyes half closed. Tell me about the argument. What argument? Mrs. Vance mentioned that she and her husband argued the day before his death. About his business affairs, she said. What were the specifics? Kramer consulted his notebook. According to the staff, there was a loud discussion Wednesday afternoon in Vance's study. The butler heard raised voices but couldn't make out words. Mrs. Vance came out looking upset. That evening at dinner, they barely spoke. Was this unusual? The butler says tensions had been high for about a week, ever since some business deal went south. Consolidated Dynamics merger. Kramer looked up sharply. How do you know about that? I read the newspapers, Inspector. Unlike most citizens, I occasionally comprehend what I read. Wolfe reached for his beer. The merger was completed 3 weeks ago. Mr. Vance's firm, Vance and Stoddard, acted as financial advisors. The transaction was reportedly quite lucrative. Yeah, well, apparently not everyone was happy about it. We've been getting reports that some of Vance's business associates felt they got shortchanged. Kramer closed his notebook. But that's just background noise. The wife did it, Wolfe. Simple as that. Murder, Wolfe said, is never simple. 'Tis merely stupid with complications. Before Kramer could respond, the doorbell rang. I glanced at my watch. Exactly 11 o'clock. Mrs. Vance was punctual at least. I went to let her in. She looked more composed than yesterday, though the strain showed in the tightness around her eyes. She wore a navy dress with pearls, the kind of outfit designed to convey respectability and quiet dignity. When she entered the office and saw Kramer, she stopped. Inspector, she said coolly. Mrs. Vance. Kramer didn't rise. Nice of you, too. Join us. Wolfe gestured to one of the yellow chairs I'd positioned near his desk. Please sit, madam. We were just discussing your husband's murder. Inspector Kramer believes you killed him. I find his reasoning adequate but unimaginative. Mrs. Vance's eyes widened slightly, but she sat. Thank you for that vote of confidence. I offered no such thing. I merely noted that the inspector's conclusion, while logical given the available evidence, fails to account for certain incongruities. Wolfe shifted his bulk. For instance, you discovered your husband's body at 6:40 in the morning. Why? I told you yesterday. You told me you wished to discuss weekend plans. A manifest absurdity. Your husband had been shot hours earlier. You did not hear the shot, though your bedroom is in the same house. You did not notice his absence from your bed. Presumably you sleep in separate rooms. Yet at 6:30 in the morning, you felt compelled to discuss a charity gala scheduled for tomorrow evening. Madam, I insult neither your intelligence nor mine. What actually drew you to your husband's study at that hour? Mrs. Vance's hands tightened in her lap. Kramer leaned forward, his cigar pointing at her like an accusation. I couldn't sleep, she said finally. I'd been awake since 4. Theodore and I had argued, as the inspector mentioned. I wanted to apologize, to try to make peace before the weekend. About what specifically had you argued? She hesitated, and I saw the calculation in her eyes, weighing what to reveal, what to conceal. Finally, she said, about money. Be specific. Theodore had made certain financial decisions without consulting me, decisions that affected our shared assets. I was angry. What decisions? He'd moved approximately $5 million from our joint accounts into offshore holdings. I discovered this on Wednesday afternoon when I reviewed our monthly statements. When I confronted him, he became defensive and told me it was none of my business. Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. $5 million moved without your knowledge or consent, and he claimed it was none of your business. Thus were his exact words. Did he explain the purpose of this transfer? Said it was related to the Consolidated Dynamics merger, that there were tax implications he was managing. But he refused to provide details. Kramer made a note. You didn't mention any of this yesterday. Didn't think it was relevant. $5 million isn't relevant. Kramer's voice dripped skepticism. I didn't kill my husband, Inspector. Spess's voice hardened. Yes. I was angry about the money. Yes, we argued. But I didn't shoot him. Wolfe was silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on her face. Then he said, Who benefits from your husband's death besides yourself? No one. His estate passes entirely to me. His business partner? Lawrence Stoddard. He and Theodore founded the firm together 15 years ago. But the partnership agreement stipulates that if one partner dies, his share of the firm passes to his heirs, not to the surviving partner. Lawrence gains nothing. Other business associates? Theodore had many professional relationships, but no one who would benefit directly from his death. Enemies. Mrs. Vance almost smiled. Mr. Wolfe. My husband was a financier. He made his living by being smarter, faster, and more ruthless than his competitors. He had dozens of enemies, but none who would commit murder over a business deal. You seem certain of that. I am. Theodore's world operated on different rules. Money was won and lost, but violence was beyond the pale. These men fight with lawyers and leverage, not bullets. Wolfe grunted. A romantic view of capitalism, madam. But we'll table that discussion. He turned to Kramer. Has your investigation uncovered any evidence of an intruder? None. The house has a security system, old, but functional. It was armed when Mrs. Vance discovered the body. No windows or doors showed signs of tampering. The only people in the house overnight were Mrs. Vance and the 3 staff members, their alibis. The cook, butler, and maid all sleep on the 3rd floor. They heard nothing unusual. The cook was up at 5:30 to start breakfast preparations. But she didn't go to the 2nd floor until Mrs. Vance called down at 6:45 saying there'd been an accident. An accident? Wolfe repeated. Interesting phrasing. Mrs. Vance's face flushed. I was in shock. I didn't know what else to say. Most people, Wolfe observed, would say there'd been a murder. The silence that followed had weight to it. Kramer watched Mrs. Vance like a cat watches a mouse hole. I kept my pencil moving, getting it all down. Finally, Wolfe said, Inspector, has the medical examiner determined the precise time of death? Between midnight and 2 a.m.? Can't narrow it more than that. And the gun was found on the floor beside Mr. Vance's chair. Correct. Wiped clean of fingerprints, except for Mrs. Vance's. No, her prints were the only ones on it. No evidence it had been wiped. Curious. Wolfe's eyes opened fully. A murderer takes the trouble to use the victim's wife's gun. It's presumably to implicate her, but then leaves her fingerprints on it. Either supremely confident or remarkably stupid, Kramer said flatly. The wife actually did it, perhaps. Wolfe turned to Mrs. Vance. When did you last handle the gun? I don't know. Weeks ago. I kept it in my nightstand, but rarely thought about it. Was it loaded? Yes. 6 bullets. How many remained? 5. Wolfe nodded slowly. Archie, call Saul. And Fred? Tell them to be here at 2 o'clock. Telephone Mr. Lawrence Stoddard. Inform him that I wish to see him this afternoon at 3. Hold on, Kramer said. Stoddard's already been questioned. By the police? Yes. Now he'll be questioned by me. The methods differ. Wolfe levered himself up. Write a process that always looked like continental drift. "Mrs. Vance, you'll remain in the city and available. Inspector Kramer, I trust you'll delay any arrest until I've completed my preliminary investigation?" Kramer stood, jamming his cigar back between his teeth. "I'll give you until Monday morning, but if you're wasting my time, Wolfe, I waste no one's time but my own, and I do that only in the service of beer and orchids. Good day, Inspector." After Kramer left, Mrs. Vance remained seated, her composure finally cracking enough to show genuine fear underneath. "Mr. Wolfe," she said quietly. "Do you believe me?" "Belief," Wolfe said, "is for priests and fools. I deal in facts. When I have enough of them, I'll know whether you killed your husband. Until then, I remain agnostic on the subject of your guilt." "That's not very comforting." "I am not in the comfort business, madam. I am in the truth business. The two are rarely compatible." He dismissed her with a wave, and I showed her out. When I returned, Wolfe was pouring another beer, his face settled into the expression he wore when thinking hard. "So," I said, "what's your read?" "She's lying," Wolfe said. "But not necessarily about murder. She's lying about something else entirely. The question is, what and whether it's connected to her husband's death. The $5 million. Possibly. Or possibly something else involving that Consolidated Dynamics merger. Archie, before Saul and Fred arrive, I want you to visit the public library and research that transaction thoroughly. Participants, terms, timeline, everything. There's something in that deal that matters. You think it's connected to Vance's death? I think Wolfe said that $5 million transferred offshore 1 week before a murder is not a coincidence. I think Mrs. Vance knows more than she's telling. And I think our next visitor this afternoon will provide additional pieces to this puzzle. He drained his beer and set down the glass with finality. "Now go," he said. "I need to think, and your chatter interferes with contemplation." I grinned and grabbed my coat. The game was getting interesting. The New York Public Library's business section had everything I needed, though it took 2 hours of digging through financial journals, newspapers, and SEC filings to piece together the full picture of the Consolidated Dynamics merger. By the time I left at 1:30, I had 8 pages of notes and a headache from squinting at microfilm. Back at the brownstone, found Saul Panzer and Fred Durkin, already in the office with Wolfe. Saul sat in one of the yellow chairs looking like a middle-aged jockey who'd learned to read minds, while Fred occupied the other, his broad, honest face, patient and attentive. They were the best operatives in New York, and Wolfe used them whenever a case required legwork. He was too immovable to perform himself. "Ah, Archie." Wolfe glanced up from his desk. "Your findings?" I flipped open my notebook. The Consolidated Dynamics merger was completed 3 weeks ago, October 4th. Consolidated Dynamics is a defense contractor specializing in radar systems and electronic components. They were acquired by Hartwell Industries, a conglomerate out of Chicago, for $82 million. Vance and Stoddard served as exclusive financial advisors to Consolidated's board of directors and received a fee of $2.4 million. Who represented Hartwell Industries? Their in-house legal team and Brennan and Associates, a Chicago investment bank. Principals involved. On the Consolidated side, Richard Halpern, CEO and majority shareholder, Martin Kelso, CFO, and 3 board members. On the Hartwell side, James Hartwell himself and his chief counsel, a man named Philip Drexel. Vance and Stoddard handled the negotiations and due diligence for Consolidated. Wolfe's eyes were closed, but I knew he was listening with complete attention. Continue. The merger was controversial. 2 of Consolidated's board members, George Brennan and a woman named Iris Carmichael, initially opposed the sale, claiming the price was too low, but they eventually voted in favor after Vance apparently persuaded them the deal was optimal. How did he persuade them? The articles don't say specifically, it's just that Vance presented additional financial analysis that changed their minds. Interesting. Wolfe opened his eyes. The timeline, negotiations began in July. The deal was announced in August, finalized in early October. Vance transferred $5 million to offshore accounts on October 8th, 4 days after the merger completed and 5 days before his murder, Wolfe grunted. $5 million is approximately double Vance and Stoddard's fee for the transaction. I noticed that too, which suggests that he was moving more than just his share of the fee, maybe company funds, or money from somewhere else, or Wolfe said, payment for something beyond his advisory services. He turned to Saul and Fred. Gentlemen, here are your assignments. Saul, I want you to investigate the two consolidated board members who opposed the merger, George Brennan and Iris Carmichael. Learn everything, their financial situations, their relationships with Vance, their current states of mind. Fred, visit the Vance residence on Riverside Drive. Talk to the household staff, cook, butler, maid. I want to know about the family's routines, tensions, visitors in the past month, anything irregular. What am I looking for specifically? Fred asked. Inconsistencies. The staff told the police they heard nothing unusual the night of the murder. But people always hear something. Find out what they're not saying. Saul stood, already processing his assignment. When do you want reports? Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock? Both of you. After they left, I said, what about Lawrence Stoddard? He'll be here in 20 minutes. Indeed. And I expect Mr. Stoddard to be defensive, evasive, and economical with truth. Business partners always are when one of them dies violently. Wolfe reached for his beer. Your impression of the merger details smells funny. Vance convinces two opposing board members to change their votes, then immediately moves $5 million offshore. Either he was paid to deliver their votes, or he was hiding money from someone, maybe even from Stoddard. Both possibilities merit exploration, but consider a third. Perhaps Vance discovered something during the merger process that made the $5 million necessary for reasons unrelated to the transaction itself. Like what? Extortion, payment of a debt, or flight capital money held in reserve for a rapid departure should circumstances require it. You think Vance was planning to run? Think Vance moved $5 million 4 days after a major transaction and was murdered 9 days later? The sequence is suggestive. The doorbell rang at 3 o'clock sharp. Lawrence Stoddard was a trim man in his early 50s with silver hair, tailored suit, and the kind of handshake that boardrooms train into people. He entered the office with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms, and the wariness of someone who suspected he might not be the smartest person in this one. Mr. Wolfe. He settled into the red leather chair and crossed his legs with careful precision. I appreciate your willingness to see me, though I'm not sure what I can contribute. I've already spoken with the police at length. The police, Wolfe said, ask questions designed to confirm their theories. I ask questions designed to discover facts. The two methods rarely overlap, studied Stoddard, with the dispassionate interest of an entomologist examining a beetle.
Wow.
How long had you been partners with Theodore Vance? 15 years? We founded the firm together in 1936. A successful partnership? Extremely. We complemented each other well. Theodore was brilliant with numbers and strategy. I handled client relations and business development. No tensions? Stoddard's smile was careful. Every partnership has tensions, Mr. Wolfe, but ours was fundamentally sound. How did you divide profits? Equally 50-50 on all fees and commissions, including the Consolidated Dynamics merger. A flicker of something crossed Stoddard's face, irritation, maybe, or caution. Yes, so you each received $1.2 million from that transaction. That's correct. When was the fee paid? October 5th, the day after the merger finalized. Wolfe's fingers drummed once on his desk, a rare gesture that signaled he'd caught a cent. And how was the payment distributed? Deposited into the firm's general account, then transferred to our individual accounts according to our standard procedure. Both transfers completed on October 5th. Yes, then perhaps you can explain why your partner moved an additional $5 million to offshore accounts 3 days later? Stoddard's face went very still. I don't know what you're talking about. Come now, Mr. Stoddard. Your partner moved $5 million on October 8th. This is fact, not conjecture. Mrs. Vance discovered the transfer on Wednesday and confronted her husband about it. They argued. The next night, he was murdered. Did you know about this transfer? No. The word came out flat and hard. Had your partner made such transfers before? Not to my knowledge. And you reviewed the firm's accounts regularly? Weekly. But Theodore handled our offshore portfolio, so that was his domain. Stoddard's composure was cracking now, his voice tightening. Are you suggesting Theodore stole from the firm? I'm suggesting nothing. I'm establishing facts. Did the Consolidated Dynamics merger proceed smoothly? No complications? None worth mentioning? Then mention the ones not worth mentioning. Stoddard's jaw worked for a moment. Finally, he said, there was some resistance from two board members initially, George Brennan and Iris Carmichael. They felt the sale price was too low, but Theodore convinced them otherwise. How? By demonstrating that Hartwell's offer was optimal given market conditions and Consolidated's growth trajectory. Theodore prepared a comprehensive financial analysis. After reviewing it, both Brennan and Carmichael agreed to support the merger. Yes. Analysis, was it accurate? Of course it was accurate. Theodore was many things, but he was never sloppy with numbers. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes half closed. Let me pose a hypothetical, Mr. Stoddard. Suppose your partner had received payments separate from the firm's advisory fee to ensure that certain board members voted in favor of the merger. Would such an arrangement be illegal? Absolutely. That would constitute fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, but profitable, extremely. Someone wanted to guarantee a merger went through and was willing to pay for certainty. Stoddard stopped himself. But Theodore would never have done that. Our reputation was built on integrity. Reputations, Wolfe observed, are built on appearances. They may or may not reflect reality. He shifted his bulk. Who had the most to gain from the Consolidated merger? Hartwell Industries acquired a valuable defense contractor at what was frankly a very favorable price. Richard Halpern, Consolidated CEO, received $20 million for his majority stake. The other shareholders did well. Everyone benefited, except Brennan and Carmichael, who initially opposed the sale. They benefited too in the end. Their shares were worth more than they'd claimed. Or perhaps they simply believed Theodore's analysis and concluded resistance was futile. Stoddard stood abruptly. Mr. Wolfe, I don't know what you're implying, but Theodore Vance was my partner and my friend. If he moved $5 million, he had a reason. And if someone killed him, it had nothing to do with the Consolidated merger. That deal was clean, perhaps. Or perhaps your friend was more creative than you knew. Wolfe waved a hand in dismissal. Thank you for your time, Mr. Stoddard. Archie will show you out. In the hall, Stoddard turned to me, his face tight with anger. Your employer is suggesting. My partner was corrupt. My employer, I said, is suggesting someone murdered your partner. He's trying to figure out why. If you know something that would help, now's the time to share it. Stoddard's eyes searched mine for a moment. Then he said, Theodore called me on Wednesday afternoon, after his argument with Claudia. Said there was something he needed to tell me, but not over the phone. He asked if we could meet for lunch. On Friday, which would have been yesterday. Did he say what it was about? No, but he sounded. Stoddard hesitated, worried, which was unlike him. Theodore didn't worry. He calculated, he strategized, but he didn't worry. Did you tell the police this? They didn't ask about phone calls? They only wanted to know about the argument with his wife. I filed that away. Anything else? Stoddard shook his head and left. Back in the office, Wolfe was reading the financial pages with his beer, but I knew his mind was elsewhere. So I said, Stoddard claims ignorance about the $5 million, but he's lying about something, obviously. And Vance was planning to tell him something important on Friday, a conversation that never happened because Vance was murdered Thursday night. Correct. Which suggests Vance knew something dangerous, something worth killing him over. Wolfe set down the paper. Archie, consider the timeline. The merger completes October 4th. Vance receives his fee October 5th. He moves $5 million. October 8th. Argues with his wife October 12th. He's murdered October 13th. What does that sequence suggest? That whatever Vance was involved in, it started after the merger completed, got paid, then something happened. That made him move a lot of money very quickly. Precisely. Which means the $5 million was not payment for services during the merger. It was payment for something else. Or payment to avoid something else. Blackmail. Possibly. Or insurance. Or flight capital, as I suggested earlier. Wolfe drained his beer. We need to know more about George Brennan and Iris Carmichael. Saul will report tomorrow. In the meantime, we wait. And Mrs. Vance is lying about her husband's activities. But whether she's lying because she knows he was corrupt, or because she suspects it, or because she's protecting someone else, that remains to be determined. He glanced at the clock. It was 4 p.m. time for him to ascend to the plant rooms. He stood with his usual glacial pace. We'll continue tomorrow after Saul and Fred report. For now, I have orchids to attend to. Eh? At least, don't lie. They just sit there and cost a fortune. Precisely, Wolfe said. An honest relationship. He left, and I sat at my desk, reviewing my notes. Somewhere in the facts we'd gathered was a pattern of motive, hiding behind numbers and offshore accounts. And board votes? Wolfe would find it. He always did. The question was whether we'd find it before Inspector Kramer arrested Mrs. Vance. Or before whoever killed Theodore Vance decided to kill again. Saul Panzer arrived at 8:55 Saturday morning, which meant he had news worth delivering early. Fred Durkin showed up at 8:58, which meant he was being punctual. I let them both in and got them settled in the office with coffee while we waited for Wolfe to descend from the plant rooms at 9. He appeared at 9 o'clock precisely, crossed to his desk, and lowered himself into his chair with the care of a suspension bridge settling onto its pylons. He glanced at Saul and Fred, then at me. Coffee, he said. I poured him a cup. He took a sip. Grimaced. He tolerated coffee only before Bir Arzan turned to Saul. Report. Saul Panzer had the kind of face that looked ordinary from across. A room, but revealed depths of intelligence up close. He never wasted words, which was one reason Wolfe prized him. George Brennan, Saul began, is 58 years old. Lives in a townhouse on East 68th Street, married with 2 grown children. He joined Consolidated Dynamics Board in 1945, after investing $200,000 in the company. His stake in the merger netted him approximately $3.2 million, yet he opposed the sale, Wolfe said. Initially, yes, courting. To a colleague I spoke with at the Merchants, club where Brennan, lunches regularly, he thought Hartwell's offer undervalued Consolidated by at least $20 million. He was prepared to vote against it and convince other board members to hold out for a better deal. What changed his mind? Theodore Vance. Brennan met with Vance privately on September 20th. After that meeting, Brennan reversed his position and voted in favor of the merger. Do we know what was discussed at that meeting? No, but Brennan's been under financial pressure recently. He lost heavily in the stock market crash of '49 and has been rebuilding his portfolio. $3.2 million from the merger cleared most of his debts. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Was he desperate enough to accept a bribe? Possibly. Or desperate enough to be convinced by financial analysis that aligned with his interests? Was he the night of October 13th? At home with his wife? She confirms it, but she's hardly a neutral witness. Wolfe nodded and turned to Fred, the household staff. Fred Durkin had spent 20 years as a policeman before going private, and he had a gift for making people comfortable enough to talk. His broad, honest face inspired trust. I spoke with all 3, Fred said, consulting his notes. And the cook is a woman named Mrs. Harriet Walsh, 62, been with the Vances for 8 years. The butler is Edmund Pierce, 55, employed there for 6 years. The maid is a young woman named Dorothy Chen, 24, been there 2 years. Their accounts of that night, consistent with what they told the police? All 3 were. In their rooms on the 3rd floor by 11 p.m., none of them heard a gunshot. Mrs. Walsh woke at 5:30 to start breakfast. Pierce came down at 6. Dorothy at 6:15. None of them went to the 2nd floor until Mrs. Vance called down at 6:45 saying there'd been an accident. Did any of them express opinions about the Vances' marriage? Fred shifted in his chair. Mrs. Walsh was the most talkative. She said the Vances were cordial, but distant, separate bedrooms. Separate schedules. Mr. Vance worked late most nights. Mrs. Vance spent her time with charity boards and social events. According to Mrs. Walsh, they hadn't entertained guests at home in over a month. Unusual, apparently. Mrs. Walsh said they used to have dinner parties twice a month. But after the summer, Mr. Vance stopped wanting company. Did she speculate as to why? She thought he was under business stress. He'd become irritable, snapping at the staff over small things. And he'd started drinking more heavily scotch in his study after dinner, sometimes until midnight or later. Wolfe grunted. A man under pressure? From what source? Mrs. Walsh didn't know, but she mentioned something else that might be relevant. On October 8th, the day Vance moved the $5 million. Man came to the house around 7 p.m. and met with Vance in his study for about an hour. Description: mid-40s, well-dressed, dark hair. Pierce answered the door but didn't catch the name. The man said he had an appointment with Mr. Vance, and Pierce showed him to the study. When he left, Pierce said he looked satisfied. Those were his words. Did Pierce mention this to the police? No. They didn't ask about visitors, only about the night of the murder. No, they didn't ask about visitors, only about the night of the murder. Wolfe's fingers drummed on his desk. Archie, call Mrs. Vance. Ask her if she knows who visited her husband on October 8th. I made the call. Mrs. Vance answered on the third ring, her voice tight with controlled anxiety. Mrs. Vance. This is Archie Goodwin. Quick question. Did your husband have any visitors at home on the evening of October 8th? October 8th. That was the Monday after the merger. Completed? Wait. Yes. Someone came to see Theodore that evening. I was upstairs and didn't see him, but I heard Theodore talking in his study afterward. Do you know who it was? No. Theodore didn't tell me, and I didn't ask. Why? Just gathering information. Thank you, Mrs. Vance. I hung up and relayed her answer to Wolfe. Interesting, he murmured. A mysterious visitor on the day Vance moved $5 million offshore. Saul, what about Iris Carmichael? Saul flipped a page in his notebook. Iris Carmichael, 47 years old, lives on Park Avenue. Divorced, no children. She's been on Consolidated's board since 1948, representing an investment group that held about 15% of the company. The merger netted her group approximately $12 million. Yet she also opposed the sale, vehemently. She made her position clear in board meetings, arguing that Consolidated was worth far more than Hartwell was offering. She and Brennan were allies in trying to block the deal. What changed her mind? She also met privately with Theodore Vance on September 22nd, 2 days after Brennan's meeting. After that, she withdrew her opposition and voted in favor of the merger. She spoken publicly about why she changed her position? No. I tried to approach her yesterday evening at a gallery opening in Soho. She refused to discuss it, saying only that Vance's analysis had been persuasive, and that the merger was in Consolidated's best interests. Her financial situation? Solid. The $12 million from the merger made her investment group very happy. No apparent financial pressure. Where was she the night of October 13th? She attended a theater performance with friends. The play ended at 10:45, and she was home by 11:30. Her doorman confirmed she didn't leave again that night. Wolfe sat back, his eyes closed, his fingers interlaced over his middle expanse. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Fred shifted uncomfortably. Saul waited with his usual patience. I knew better than to interrupt. Finally, Wolfe opened his eyes. Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Ask him to come here at 11 o'clock. Tell him I have information relevant to his investigation. You know who killed Vance?
Us.
No, but I know what Theodore Vance was doing and why he moved $5 million offshore. And I suspect Inspector Kramer is about to arrest the wrong person for murder. Kramer arrived at 11 sharp, his unlit cigar jutting from his jaw like a cannon. He dropped into the red leather chair and fixed Wolfe with a skeptical glare.
Oh.
This better be good, Wolfe. The DA wants an arrest by Monday morning, and I've got Mrs. Vance at the top of my list. Then your list, Wolfe said, is inadequate. Mrs. Vance did not kill her husband. You got proof of that? I have logic. Mrs. Vance discovered that her husband had moved $5 million to offshore accounts. She was angry and confronted him, they argued. Consider. If she intended to kill him, Would she create a public record of their conflict? Would she ensure the household staff overheard their argument? Would she establish both motive and opportunity? So clearly, maybe she's not as smart as you think. On the contrary, she's quite intelligent, which is why she came to me not to prove her innocence, but to discover what her husband was involved in. She suspects something, Inspector. She knows Theodore Vance was engaged in activity that made $5 million necessary. But she doesn't know what, so enlighten me. What was Vance doing? Wolfe reached for his beer. Theodore Vance was selling. Favorable financial analysis to ensure the Consolidated Dynamics merger proceeded at a price advantageous to Hartwell Industries. He was paid $5 million for this service, delivered after the merger completed as a success fee. Kramer's cigar shifted. You're saying he took a bribe? I'm saying he was paid to manipulate to board members George Brennan and Iris Carmichael into supporting a merger they initially opposed. His comprehensive financial analysis was designed not to illuminate truth but to create conviction where there was doubt. Can you prove this? Not yet. But consider the pattern. Vance meets separately with both opposing board members. Both reverse their positions within days. The merger completes. 4 days later, $5 million appears in Vance's accounts, far more than his legitimate fee. He moves this money offshore immediately, suggesting he knew it couldn't survive. Scrutiny. Who paid him that? Wolfe said, is the question. Someone with a powerful interest in seeing the merger complete at Hartwell's offered price. Someone who stood to gain more than the difference between what Consolidated was actually worth and what Hartwell paid for it. Hartwell himself? Possibly? Or someone acting on his behalf? Or someone else entirely who benefited from the merger? In ways not yet apparent, Kramer made notes. And you think this person killed Vance? I think Theodore Vance became dangerous. Perhaps he grew a conscience. Perhaps he feared exposure. Perhaps he intended to confess to his partner, Lawrence Stoddard, which is why he arranged to meet Stoddard on Friday for a conversation that never occurred. Someone decided Vance was too great a risk and eliminated him, using his wife's gun to throw suspicion on her. Precisely. The murderer was in the house that night, Inspector. Here she knew where Mrs. Vance kept her revolver, knew the security system, knew the household layout. This was not a stranger breaking in. This was someone familiar with the Vance's domestic arrangements. Kramer stood, his face hard. You got any idea who this someone is? Not yet, but I will. Archie, Saul, Fred, you have your assignments. Want to know who visited Theodore Vance on October 8th? I want to know everyone who had access to that house in the past month. I want to know who stood to gain most from the Consolidated merger besides the obvious parties. After Kramer left, Saul said, Where do we start? With the visitor on October 8th, Wolfe replied. Find him. The mystery of this case doesn't lie in who pulled the trigger, but in who had the most to lose from Theodore Vance's continued existence. He dismissed them, and I sat at my desk reviewing notes. I really think Mrs. Vance is innocent? Asked. I think Wolfe said that she's terrified of what we might discover. But fear of exposure is not the same as guilt of murder. The person who killed Theodore Vance is someone we haven't yet properly considered. Someone who saw him as a threat, not as a meal ticket. One of the board members? Unlikely. They both profited from the merger. Why kill the man who made them? Richer? Than who? Wolfe's eyes closed. Someone who had more to lose than money. Someone whose exposure would mean more than financial ruin. Someone who understood that Theodore Vance in his growing panic was about to confess everything. He fell silent, and I knew he was running through scenarios, testing theories against facts, looking for the flaw in the logic that would reveal truth. Somewhere in the tangle of offshore accounts and board, votes and midnight visitors was a murderer. We just had to find him before. Inspector Kramer ran out of patience and, before Mrs. Vance ran out of time. By Monday afternoon, we'd hit a wall. Saul had spent 2 days trying to identify the mysterious visitor from October 8th, but the trail was cold. Pierce, the butler, remembered only that the man had been well-dressed and confident. Description that fit half the businessmen in Manhattan. Mrs. Walsh hadn't seen him at all. Dorothy Chen had been upstairs and recalled nothing useful. Fred had canvassed the neighborhood around the Vance residence on Riverside Drive. looking for anyone who might have noticed unusual activity the night of the murder. Nothing. The houses on that block were set back from the street, separated by walls and hedges. People minded their own business. I'd spent Monday morning at the public library again, digging deeper into the Consolidated Dynamics merger, cross-referencing names, looking for connections that might explain who paid Vance $5 million. The more I dug, the more complicated it became. Hartwell Industries had dozens of subsidiaries and partnerships. Consolidated's board had complex financial relationships. Following the money was like trying to untangle spaghetti in the dark. Wolfe had been in a foul mood since Sunday evening, barely touching Fritz's veal, but could always a bad sign. He sat at his desk with his eyes closed, moving his lips soundlessly, a habit that meant he was running through the facts in his mind, searching for the detail that didn't fit at 2:30. The doorbell rang. I looked through the glass and saw Inspector Kramer, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a tall man in his mid-40s, with dark hair going gray at the temples, expensive suit, and the kind of bearing that suggested he was accustomed to deference.
Allie.
I let them both in. Mr. Wolfe, Kramer said without preamble. This is Philip Drexel, Chief Counsel for Hartwell Industries. He has information about the Vance case. Drexel settled into the red leather chair with the ease of someone who spent his life in executive offices. He crossed his legs and regarded Wolfe with cool assessment. Mr. Wolfe, Inspector Kramer tells me you've been investigating Theodore Vance's murder and that you believe his death is connected to the Consolidated Dynamics merger. I believe, Wolfe said, that Theodore Vance was murdered because of something he knew or something he did relating to that merger. Whether the connection is direct or tangential remains to be determined. Then I may be able to clarify matters. Drexel reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder. On October 8th, 5 days before Vance was murdered, I visited him at his home on Riverside Drive. I believe I'm the mysterious visitor your operatives have been trying to identify. The office went very quiet. Wolfe's eyes opened fully. Continue. He said, I went to see Vance because I'd discovered an irregularity in the consolidated merger documents. During my final review of the transaction, which I always conduct after a deal closes, I noticed that certain financial projections Vance and Stoddard had provided to Consolidated's board didn't match the underlying data in our due diligence. Files. Be specific. Vance had projected that Consolidated's revenues would decline by approximately 15% over the next 3 years due to defense budget cuts and increased competition. His analysis made Hartwell's offer appear quite generous, arguably the best Consolidated could expect given market conditions. But the projections were inaccurate? Not inaccurate. Deliberately pessimistic. Our own analysis showed that Consolidated's revenue stream was far more stable than Vance indicated. Again, in fact, the company had recently secured several long-term contracts that virtually guaranteed revenue growth of 8 to 10% annually. Wolfe's fingers drummed once on his desk. So Vance understated Consolidated's value to make Hartwell's offer appear favorable. Precisely. His analysis convinced two skeptical board members, Brennan and Carmichael, that selling at Hartwell's price was prudent. Without that analysis, they would have held out for more money, possibly blocked the merger entirely. How much more was Consolidated actually worth? It's based on accurate projections. At least $20 million more than what Hartwell paid. Kramer leaned forward, his cigar jabbing the air. So Vance cheated his own clients to help Hartwell Industries get a bargain. That's how it appeared to me, Drexel said. Which is why I confronted him on October 8th. What did he say? Drexel's expression darkened. He denied it at first, claimed his projections were conservative but honest. But when I showed him the contracts he'd omitted from his analysis contracts that were matters of public record, hit. Changed tactics, said he'd made an error, that he'd been working under time pressure and missed certain details. Did you believe him? No. The omissions were too convenient, too perfectly aligned with making Hartwell's offer look better than. I told Vance that I planned to report my findings to the SEC and to Consolidated's board, that his firm's reputation would be destroyed, and he'd likely face criminal charges for breach of fiduciary duty. How did he react? He became agitated, said I didn't understand the full situation, that there were factors I wasn't aware of. He asked for 48 hours before I filed any reports. Said he needed time to set things right. Wolfe's eyes were half closed now, his attention absolute. Did you agree? Yes. I told him I'd wait until Friday, October 14th. After that, I was going public with what I'd found. October 14th, Wolfe murmured. The day after he was murdered. Exactly. Which is why I came to Inspector Kramer. This morning, I'd been traveling on business since October 9th and only learned about Vance's death yesterday when I returned to New York. When I read that his wife was the primary suspect, I knew I had to come forward. Kramer stubbed out his cigar in the ashtray on Wolfe's desk, a liberty he took only when particularly agitated. So somebody killed Vance before he could confess to you? It appears that way, though I'm not certain what Vance meant by setting things right, whether he planned to confess, return the money, or do something else entirely. Wolfe sat forward slightly, his bulk shifting. Mr. Drexel, did you inform anyone else about your discovery before confronting Vance? No. Did you tell anyone afterward? Only my assistant, who handles my confidential files. I wanted the documentation properly secured before I filed formal complaints.
Oh, your assistant's name?
Patricia Hollis. She's been with me for 12 years. Completely trustworthy. No one else? Drexel hesitated. I may have mentioned it to James Hartwell himself. He called me on October 9th about an unrelated matter, and I told him I'd discovered an irregularity in the consolidated deal that I was investigating, but I didn't provide details. How did Mr. Hartwell react? He told me to pursue it thoroughly and report back to him once I had complete information. He takes corporate ethics very seriously. I'm sure he does, Wolfe said, dryly. Particularly when someone else's ethics have saved him $20 million. Mr. Drexel, you know who paid Theodore Vance $5 million to provide his misleading analysis? I assumed it was Hartwell Industries, which is why I was investigating. But I found no record of any such payment in our books. Our fee to Brennan and Associates for handling the merger was standard. Nothing unusual. Then the payment came from somewhere else, so it would seem. Wolfe was silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. Then he said, "Thank you, Mr. Drexel. You've clarified several important points. Archie, show Mr. Drexel out." After Drexel left, Kramer remained seated, his expression grim. So Vance was going to confess. Somebody knew it and killed him before. He could, perhaps, Wolfe said, or perhaps something else entirely occurred. Archie, your notebook. I flipped it open, waiting. Review Mr. Drexel's statement, Wolfe said. Note the timeline carefully. I scanned my notes. Drexel confronts Vance on October 8th. Vance asks for 48 hours. Drexel agrees to wait until October 14th. Vance is murdered on October 13th, one day before the deadline. Precisely. Which suggests that the murderer knew about Drexel's deadline and acted just before Vance was forced to make a decision. Or, Wolfe said, that Vance had already made a decision and the murderer acted to prevent him from carrying it out. Consider, Vance argues with his wife on October 12th. He calls his partner Lawrence Stoddard that same day and asks to meet on Friday, October 14th, the day of Drexel's deadline. What does that sequence suggest? Kramer leaned forward. That Vance was planning to confess to Stoddard on Friday.
Yes.
Or planning to ask for help, or planning to discuss what to do about Drexel's ultimatum. But here's what troubles me. Vance was murdered Thursday night, sometime between midnight and 2 a.m., yet Drexel's deadline wasn't until Friday. Why kill him before the deadline if you're trying to prevent confession? Because the killer didn't want to take chances, I suggested. Perhaps, but consider another possibility. Vance had already set something in motion, a letter written perhaps, or a confession prepared, or evidence secured somewhere safe to be delivered upon his death. You think Vance left something behind? I think Vance was frightened. He moved $5 million offshore flight capital, as I suggested earlier. He arranged to meet with his partner. He knew Drexel's deadline was approaching. A prudent man in such circumstances would protect himself. Leave evidence somewhere safe, with instructions for its release, if something happened to him. Kramer stood. That's true, where is it? That, Wolfe said, is what we must discover. Archie, call Mrs. Vance. Ask her if her husband maintained a safety deposit box, and if so, where. I made the call. Mrs. Vance confirmed that her husband had a box at the Merchants Trust Bank on Fifth Avenue. She had a key, but Vance had told her never to access it without his permission. Did you ever look inside?
Asked.
No, Theodore was very particular about his privacy. I relayed this to Wolfe. Inspector. Wolfe said you'll need a warrant too. Examine that box. Mrs. Vance can provide consent, but it would be prudent to have legal authority. I'll have it by this afternoon. Kramer headed for the door, then paused. Wolfe, if there's evidence in that box proving who paid Vance and that person killed him, then we'll have both motive and identity. Yes, Inspector, which is why I suggest you move quickly. If the murderer suspects such evidence exists, he may attempt to access it himself. After Kramer left, I said, you really think Vance left something in that box? I think Vance was intelligent enough to recognize that. Men who pay $5 million for corruption rarely leave loose ends. He would have protected himself. Wolfe reached for his beer. But there's something else that troubles me. What? Mr. Drexel's statement. Consider it carefully. He discovered Vance's deception, confronted him, gave him a deadline, and then conveniently left town for business travel until after Vance was murdered. You think Drexel killed him? I think Mr. Drexel's appearance this afternoon was suspiciously timely. He comes forward with information that explains the $5 million, establishes motive for murder, but conveniently provides himself with an alibi he was traveling. It's very neat, very tidy. But why would Hartwell's lawyer kill Vance? Hartwell got what he wanted, consolidated at a bargain price. Precisely. Which means if Drexel killed Vance, it wasn't to protect the merger. It was to protect something else. Wolfe's eyes closed. There's a piece missing, Archie. Something we haven't seen yet. Something that connects Drexel, Vance, and that $5 million in a way we don't yet understand. What about Lawrence Stoddard? He had access to the house. He knew about Vance's activities. Maybe Vance told him about the bribe, and Stoddard killed him to protect the firm's reputation. Stoddard benefits nothing from Vance's death. As he said, the partnership agreement passes Vance's share to his heirs, not to the surviving partner. And if Stoddard wanted to silence Vance, he had opportunities before the murder. Why wait until the night before Drexel's deadline? Then who? Someone who knew about Drexel's ultimatum? Someone who had access to the Vance residence? Someone who understood that Vance's confession would destroy more than just his reputation? It would expose a conspiracy that reached beyond simple bribery. Wolfe opened his eyes and looked at me directly. Archie, when Inspector Kramer returns with whatever he finds in that safety deposit box, we'll know who paid Vance $5 million. But we still won't know who killed him, not with certainty, because the murderer is someone we haven't properly considered. Someone who appears innocent, but is actually at the center of this entire affair. You know who it is? I have a suspicion, but I need proof. And I need one more piece of information, something small, something that seems insignificant but will reveal everything. What? I'll know it when I see it, Wolfe said. In the meantime, we wait for Kramer. And we consider very carefully who knew what and when. He closed his eyes again, and I knew the conversation was over. But I also knew that Wolfe had seen some tiny detail that didn't fit. Some small inconsistency that his methodical mind had caught and was now worrying like a dog with a bone. The case was about to break. I just hoped it broke before Inspector Kramer arrested the wrong person or before the murderer realized Wolfe was closing in. Inspector Kramer returned at 6:30 that evening, just as Fritz was preparing to serve dinner. Wolfe glared at the interruption, but waved Kramer into the office with the resigned air of a man who knows his squab with sausage and herbs will have to wait. Kramer looked like he'd aged 5 years in 6 hours. He dropped a manila envelope on Wolfe's desk and collapsed into the red leather chair. Safety deposit box, he said. You were right. Wolfe opened the envelope and extracted several documents. I moved to his shoulder to read over him. There were bank statements showing the $5 million transfer, correspondence on Hartwell Industries letterhead, and a handwritten letter. In what I assumed was Vance's script, Wolfe read in silence for 3 minutes, his face impassive. Then he set down the papers and looked at Kramer. "Extraordinary," he said. "That's one word for it." Kramer's cigar had gone out, but he chewed it. "Anyway, the letter's a confession. Vance details everything, how he was approached, what he was paid to do, who paid him. He dated it October 12th and put it in the box that afternoon, along with copies of the bank transfers and communications. The day he argued with his wife, I said, and the day he called Lawrence Stoddard to arrange their Friday meeting," Wolfe added. He picked up the handwritten letter and read aloud, "To whom it may concern, I, Theodore Vance, write this statement as a full confession of my actions regarding the Consolidated Dynamics merger. On September 15th, I was approached by Philip Drexel, chief counsel of Hartwell Industries, with a proposition. He offered me $5 million to ensure that the merger proceeded at Hartwell's proposed price of $82 million. Mr. Drexel was aware that 2 board members, George Brennan and Iris Carmichael, posed the sale as undervalued. He asked me to prepare financial analysis that would convince them to support the merger. Specifically, he wanted me to understate Consolidated's future revenue potential to make. Hartwell's offer appeared generous. I agreed to this arrangement. I met separately with Brennan and Carmichael and presented analysis that deliberately omitted favorable information about Consolidated's prospects. Both reversed their opposition and voted for the merger. The $5 million was paid to me. On October 5th, through a series of offshore transfers that Mr. Drexel assured me could not be traced to Hartwell Industries, I moved this money to my own offshore accounts on October 8th. However, on that same day, Mr. Drexel came to my home and confronted me about my work. He claimed he had discovered irregularities in my analysis and threatened to report me to the SEC. He demanded I return the money and cooperate with an investigation or face criminal charges. I believe this confrontation was staged. Mr. Drexel orchestrated this entire situation, first paying me to manipulate the merger, then threatening to expose me for doing exactly what he paid me to do. I don't know his ultimate purpose, but I suspect I am being set up as a scapegoat for something larger. I write this confession and place it in safekeeping in case something happens to me. I plan to meet with my partner, Lawrence Stoddard, on Friday, October 14th, to determine the best course of action. If this letter is being read, it means I did not survive to make that meeting. Theodore Vance. October 12th, 1951. Wolfe set down the letter and looked at Kramer. "You've arrested Mr. Drexel, I presume? We picked him up 2 hours ago." He denies. "Everything," says Vance is lying. That he never paid anyone anything. That his visit to Vance on October 8th was exactly what he claimed, discovering fraud and confronting Vance about it. Does he have an alibi for the night of October 13th? Says he was in his apartment in the Waldorf Towers from 10 p.m. onward. The hotel staff confirms he had dinner in his room at 9:30. But nobody saw him after that until the next morning. So he could have left the hotel, committed murder, and returned without being observed. It's possible. But Wolfe Kramer leaned forward, not convinced Drexel killed Vance. His story makes sense. Maybe he did discover the fraud, like he said. Maybe he did confront Vance, and maybe Vance wrote this letter as insurance to have something on Drexel, in case Drexel carried out his threat. You're suggesting Vance lied in his confession? I'm suggesting a man facing exposure and criminal charges might create a document that shifts blame elsewhere. Vance claims Drexel set him up, but maybe it was the other way around. Took the bribe from someone else entirely, and when Drexel discovered it, Vance tried to implicate him. Wolfe's eyes were half closed, his fingers interlaced over his stomach. It's an interesting theory, Inspector, but consider the logistics. Drexel didn't pay Vance $5 million. Who did? The money exists. The bank records prove it. Someone paid Vance to manipulate that merger. Maybe it was Hartwell himself, or someone else in his organization. Or hell, maybe it was someone on Consolidated's side who wanted the deal to go through. For their own reasons. And why would Vance specifically name Philip Drexel? Because Drexel threatened him. Because Vance was desperate and angry and wanted revenge. Wolfe was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Archie, call Mr. Drexel's office. Speak with his assistant, Patricia Hollis. Ask her to come here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Tell her it's urgent and relates to Mr. Drexel's arrest. Think she knows something? I think Mr. Drexel told us she's the only person he informed about the irregularities he discovered. If that's true, she may have information relevant to establishing whether his account or Vance's confession is accurate."
Ow.
After I made the call, Patricia Hollis agreed to come. Her voice tight with worry. Kramer stood to leave. "Wolfe, I've got Drexel in custody, but I need more than a dead man's letter to make charges stick. The DA wants solid evidence. If this woman can't provide it, I'll have to let him go. Then we'll ensure she provides what's necessary," Wolfe said. "In the meantime, I suggest you also bring in George Brennan and Iris Carmichael tomorrow. 10 o'clock. I want all the principals assembled here. Why? Because one of them is lying, Inspector, and the only way to determine which one is to put them all in a room together and watch what happens when their stories collide." After Kramer left, Wolfe sat motionless for several minutes, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and regular. I'd seen this before. He was running through scenarios, testing each against the facts, looking for the flaw in the logic. Finally, he opened his eyes. "Archie, what troubles you about Vance's confession?" I'd been thinking about that, the timing. He writes it on October 12th, puts it in the safety deposit box that afternoon. Why that specific day? What happened that made him suddenly decide to create insurance? Precisely. He'd known about Drexel's confrontation since October 8th, 4 days earlier. Why wait until the 12th to write the confession? Maybe he needed time to think, to decide what to do. Or perhaps something else happened on October 12th that we don't yet know about. Something that frightened him enough to create a permanent record. Wolfe reached for his beer. Consider also the content of the confession. Vance claims Drexel approached him on September 15th with the proposition. But Drexel says he only discovered the irregularities after the merger closed during his routine post-transaction review. One of them is lying. How do we prove which one? By finding evidence of contact between them before September 15th. Communications, meetings, financial records. If Drexel paid Vance $5 million, there must be a trail of offshore accounts are anonymous. But not invisible. Someone moved that money. Someone arranged the transfers. And if we can't find a trail, then we consider the alternative. That Vance lied in his confession, and the $5 million came from someone else entirely. Someone who has remained hidden throughout this investigation. Someone we haven't properly examined because we've been focused on the obvious suspects. Like who? Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Then he said, like someone who benefited not from the merger itself, but from the chaos surrounding Theodore Vance's death. Someone who needed Vance, discredited, exposed, destroyed, and saw murder as the most efficient solution. Mrs. Vance inherits $47 million. That's motive enough for most murders. But consider, she could have killed him at any time. Why wait until the night before Drexel's deadline? Why kill him when exposure was imminent and suspicion would inevitably fall on her? Unless she didn't know about Drexel's deadline precisely. Which means either she's innocent or someone else is manipulating events to make her appear guilty. Wolfe's eyes opened fully. Tomorrow morning, we'll have all the principals assembled. And I suspect one of them will reveal something crucial not through what they say, but through what they don't say. Through the pauses, the hesitations, the careful phrasings designed to conceal rather than illuminate. You know who killed Vance? I have 3 possibilities, each equally plausible. But I'm missing one element, the detail that will eliminate 2 possibilities and confirm the third. Tomorrow, with all of them in this room, I'll find that detail. He stood, signaling the conversation was over. I'll go tell Fritz we'll eat in 30 minutes. I won't let murder completely spoil my dinner, but I'll be damned if I'll let it delay my meal indefinitely. The next morning, at 8:45, I was arranging chairs in the office when the doorbell rang. Patricia Hollis had arrived early always, a sign of anxiety. She was a trim woman in her late 40s with gray-streaked brown hair, in the efficient manner of someone who'd spent decades managing other people's chaos. She wore a burgundy suit and carried a leather briefcase, and her eyes were red-rimmed like she hadn't slept. "Mr. Goodwin," she said when I let her in. "Thank you for seeing me early. I couldn't wait. I've been up all night thinking about Mr. Drexel's arrest." I showed her to the office. Wolfe hadn't yet descended from the plant rooms, so I offered her coffee and sat at my desk. "Tell me about Philip Drexel," I said. "You've worked for him 12 years. What kind of man is he?" "Brilliant. Demanding, ethical, to a fault." Her hands tightened around her coffee cup. "That's why I know he didn't do what they're saying. Mr. Drexel would never bribe someone to manipulate a business deal. It's completely contrary to everything he believes. But he did discover Theodore Vance's fraud. Yes, on October 7th. During his routine post-transaction review, he always does this, examines every detail of completed deals to ensure everything was proper. When he found the discrepancies in Vance's analysis, he was furious, called it a betrayal of professional trust, and he confronted Vance the next day? Yes. Went to Vance's home that evening. When he returned to the office on October 9th, he told me what he'd found and said he was filing formal complaints with the SEC. He wanted me to document everything's the irregularities. His confrontation with Vance, his planned course of action. Did he seem worried that Vance might retaliate? No. He seemed righteously angry, the way he always gets when someone violates ethical standards. But not worried. Not frightened. She paused. But there was something else, something that's been bothering me since I heard about his arrest. Wolfe chose that moment to enter, descending the stairs and crossing to his desk with his usual glacial dignity. He settled into his chair and regarded Patricia Hollis with mild curiosity. "Good morning, Miss Hollis. You were saying something bothers you. Continue." She glanced at me, then at Wolfe. "What?" "On October 10th, 2 days after Mr. Drexel confronted Vance, I was filing documents in Mr. Drexel's office when I noticed something unusual. He'd received a personal letter that morning. It was still on his desk, and I saw the signature, Theodore Vance." Wolfe's eyes sharpened. "What did the letter say?" "I didn't read it, that would have been improper. But I saw Mr. Drexel read it later that morning." His face went white. "He immediately put the letter in his personal safe and told me to cancel his afternoon appointments. He spent the rest of the day in his office with the door closed." "Did he tell you what the letter contained?" "No. But that evening when I was leaving, he called me back into his office. Looked ... shaken. That's the only word for it. Mr. Drexel is never shaken. But that night he was. Asked me if I'd mentioned his discovery about Vance to anyone. Else I said no. He made me promise not to discuss it with anyone until he gave me permission." "Did he explain why?" "He said the situation was more complicated than he'd initially thought. That there were factors he needed to investigate further before going public. He said he might need to revise his plans for reporting to the SE." Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed. "Miss Hollis, think carefully. After receiving that letter from Vance, did Mr. Drexel's behavior change in any way?" "Yes. He became distracted, preoccupied. He left the office early several days that week, unusual for him. And on October 12th, he asked me to research something specific." "What?" "He wanted information about offshore banking regulations and the traceability of international wire transfers. He said it was for a different case, but ... double quotes." She trailed off. He didn't believe him. "No, Mr. Drexel never lies to me about case matters. If he said it was for something else, he must have had a reason to conceal the truth." The doorbell rang. I glanced at my watch. Exactly 9 o'clock. The morning's performance was about to begin. "That will be our other guests," Wolfe said. "Archie, show them in. Miss Hollis, please remain. What you've told me is quite illuminating." I opened the door to find Inspector Kramer with George Brennan and Iris Carmichael in tow. Both looked unhappy about being summoned, but neither had refused. Kramer had that effect on people. I settled them all in the office, Brennan and Carmichael in the yellow chairs, Kramer in his usual spot, Patricia Hollis on one of the spares I'd brought in. The office was crowded, which was exactly what Wolfe wanted. Crowded rooms made people nervous. Nervous people made mistakes. Wolfe surveyed his audience like a conductor preparing an orchestra. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we are here to discuss the murder of Theodore Vance and the corruption that preceded it. One of you knows more than you've admitted. By the end of this conversation, we'll know which one." He paused, letting the words settle. "And then," he said quietly, "we'll know who killed Theodore Vance." George Brennan shifted in his chair, his face flushed with indignation. "Mr. Wolfe, I was told this meeting concerned new evidence about Vance's death. Wasn't told I'd be accused of something." "I've accused no one," Wolfe said mildly. "Yet, I merely stated that someone in this room knows more than they've admitted. Whether that someone is you remains to be seen." He turned to Iris Carmichael. "Mrs. Carmichael, you opposed the consolidated merger initially. Why?" She was a striking woman with sharp features and sharper eyes. "Because Hartwell's offer was too low. Consolidated was worth at least $100 million, possibly more. Selling for $82 million was leaving money on the table, yet Theodore Vance convinced you otherwise. His analysis was persuasive. He demonstrated that my projections were overly optimistic, that market conditions didn't support the valuation. I'd assumed, and you believed him. I trusted him. Theodore Vance had a reputation for rigorous analysis and integrity. When he showed me data suggesting Consolidated's prospects were weaker than I'd thought, I accepted his expertise. Even though his expertise made you approximately $2 million poorer than you should have been." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Theodore Vance lied to you, that he deliberately understated Consolidated's value to ensure the merger proceeded at Hartwell's price. That you were cheated, Mrs. Carmichael, and the man who cheated you is now dead. I didn't kill Theodore Vance. Where were you the night of October 13th between midnight and 2 a.m.? In my apartment. Asleep. Alone." How convenient. Iris Carmichael's face hardened. "I had no reason to kill Theodore Vance. I didn't know he'd manipulated his analysis. Until days after his death, when Mr. Drexel's investigation became public. And even if I had known, I wouldn't have killed him over money. I'm not a murderer, Mr. Wolfe." Wolfe turned to George Brennan. "And you, sir? Where were you that night?" "At home with my wife. I've already told the police this." "Your wife being hardly a neutral witness. As I believe someone noted earlier, Mr. Brennan, you were also convinced by Vance's analysis to support a merger you initially opposed. You received $3.2 million from the sale money you badly needed to clear debts from the stock market crash of '49. How badly did you need that money?" Brennan's face went red. "Are you implying I was bribed?" "I'm asking if you were desperate enough to be persuaded by analysis you might otherwise have questioned more carefully." Theodore Vance's analysis was sound. He showed me contracts, projections, market data that omitted crucial information about Consolidated's long-term contracts and revenue stability. Data designed to make you believe selling was the prudent choice, when in fact you were being cheated. I didn't know that then, but you do now. And yet you're not angry. Most men, upon learning they'd been swindled out of millions, exhibit some degree of rage. You seem remarkably calm, Mr. Brennan, because I had nothing to do with Vance's death. Yes, I'm angry about being misled, but I didn't kill the man over it." Wolfe's gaze shifted to Patricia Hollis. "Miss Hollis, you mentioned that on October 10th, Philip Drexel received a letter from Theodore Vance, a letter that disturbed him greatly. Do you have any idea what that letter contained?" "No, sir. As I said, I didn't read it." "But you observed Mr. Drexel's reaction. Describe it precisely." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. He went pale. His hand shook slightly as he read. When he finished, he sat motionless for perhaps 2 minutes, just staring at the letter. Then he locked it in his safe and closed his office door. I'd never seen him react that way to anything. "What do you think the letter contained?" "I don't know, but it frightened him." "Mr. Drexel is not a man who frightens easily." Wolfe nodded slowly. "Inspector Kramer, did your search of Philip Drexel's office locate this letter?" "No. We found the safe empty, except for some routine legal documents. No letter from Vance. Interesting. A letter that disturbed Drexel enough to lock away, but which has now conveniently disappeared." Wolfe's eyes opened fully. Miss Hollis, think carefully. After receiving that letter, did Mr. Drexel take any other unusual actions? He left the office early on October 11th and 12th, both days around 3 p.m., which was very unlike him. And on October 13th, the day Vance was murdered, he left at noon and didn't return. Kramer leaned forward. Go? He said he had personal business. He didn't provide details, and you didn't ask. Mr. Drexel's personal time was his own? I never questioned his movements. Wolfe was silent for a long moment, his fingers interlaced over his vast middle. Then he said, Miss Hollis, I'm going to share something with you that may distress you. Theodore Vance wrote a confession before his death, claiming that Philip Drexel paid him $5 million to manipulate the consolidated merger. That Drexel orchestrated the entire scheme, then threatened to expose Vance as a way of controlling him. What do you say to that? Patricia Hollis's face went white. That's impossible. Mr. Drexel would never, and yet the confession exists. Bank records show $5 million transferred to Vance's accounts. Someone paid him. If not Drexel, then who? I don't know, but it wasn't Mr. Drexel. I'd stake my life on it. Someone already has, Wolfe said quietly.
Theodore.
Vance staked his life on believing he understood what was happening, and he was wrong. The question is, what did he misunderstand? The doorbell rang. I glanced at Wolfe, who nodded slightly. I went to the hall and peered through the glass. Standing on the stoop was Lawrence Stoddard, looking haggard and anxious. I let him in. Mr. Goodwin, he said urgently, I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately. I've just discovered something about Theodore's accounts. Something the police need to know. I showed him into the office. The room was getting crowded now. 6 guests plus Wolfe and myself. Stoddard stopped when he saw the assembled group, his eyes widening. I apologize for interrupting, he said. I didn't know you had, Mr. Stoddard, Wolfe interrupted. You've discovered something. Share it with us. Stoddard glanced around uncertainly, then pulled an envelope from his jacket. I've been reviewing the firm's accounts since Theodore's death, trying to understand the $5 million everyone's been talking about. I had our accountant trace every transaction from the past 6 months. And the $5 million didn't come from Hartwell Industries. It didn't come from Philip Drexel. It came from a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands Consolidated Holdings, Limited. The room went very quiet. Wolfe's eyes opened fully. Continue. Consolidated Holdings was established in July of this year. Its sole purpose appears to have been to make that one payment to Theodore $5 million wired on October 5th. After that, the corporation was dissolved. Who established this corporation? I don't know. The registration documents show a corporate services firm as the nominal director, but the beneficial owner is hidden behind layers of legal entities. But you have a theory. Stoddard's jaw worked. The name is suggestive. Consolidated Holdings. Too close to Consolidated Dynamics to be coincidence. I think someone inside Consolidated, someone on the board or in management, paid Theodore to manipulate the merger. Iris Carmichael stood abruptly. That's absurd. Why would anyone inside Consolidated pay to reduce the sale price? That's the opposite of our interests. Unless Wolfe said they had interests that diverged from the other. Shareholders. Mr. Stoddard, who benefited most from the merger besides the obvious shareholders. I'd have to review the full transaction documents. But he paused. There was one unusual provision. Hartwell Industries agreed to keep Consolidated's entire management team in place for 3 years, with generous compensation packages. That was a condition of the deal. Who negotiated that provision? Richard Halpern, Consolidated CEO. Wolfe's eyes were half closed again. And Mr. Halpern received how much from the merger? $20 million for his majority stake. Plus his management package is worth approximately $2 million annually. So Mr. Halpern walked away with $20 million in hand and $6 million guaranteed over 3 years. $26 million total. Had the merger not proceeded, what would his prospects have been? Uncertain. Consolidated was profitable but not growing aggressively. Halpern might have continued as CEO indefinitely, earning perhaps $500,000 annually. But he'd never have seen a lump sum like $20 million. unless he took the company public or found another buyer. Both possibilities, but both uncertain. Wolfe sat back. So Richard Halpern had powerful motivation to ensure the merger proceeded at Hartwell's price. And if 2 board members threatened to block the sale by demanding more money, he left. The thought hanging. George Brennan found his voice. You're saying Halpern paid Vance to manipulate us? I'm saying someone with deep interest in seeing the merger proceed at precisely. Hartwell's offered price-arranged payment to Theodore Vance, and when Vance became a liability, either through guilt or fear of exposure, that same someone murdered, Halpern, wasn't at the Vance residence the night of the murder, Kramer said. Are you certain? Have you verified his whereabouts? Kramer pulled out his notebook and flipped through pages. We interviewed him briefly. Said he was at a business dinner until 10 p.m., then went home. His wife confirms he was home by 10:30. His wife, again hardly neutral. Inspector, I'd suggest you verify his movements more carefully. And I suggest you examine whether Richard Halpern had any connection to the Vance household, whether he knew the layout, the security system, where Mrs. Vance kept her revolver. Before Kramer could respond, the doorbell rang again. I was getting tired of interruptions, but I went to answer it. Through the glass, I saw Mrs. Claudia Vance, her face drawn and pale. Behind her stood a man I didn't recognize, tall, distinguished. Mid-60s, with white hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. I opened the door. Mrs. Vance, I said, and this is Richard Halpern, she said, her voice tight. He came to see me this morning. Says he has information about my husband's murder. I thought Mr. Wolfe should hear it. I showed them both in. The office was now absurdly crowded at people plus Wolfe and myself. But Wolfe seemed pleased, rather than irritated, surveyed the assembled group like a general reviewing troops before battle. Mr. Halpern, he said.
Ow!
Fortuitous. We were just discussing your role in the Consolidated Dynamics merger. Perhaps you'd care to clarify a few points? Richard Halpern had the kind of smooth, confident face that came from decades of boardroom victories. He settled into the last available chair, one of the spares near the wall, and crossed his legs. Casually, Mr. Wolfe. I came here voluntarily to clear up what I suspect are serious misunderstandings about my relationship with Theodore Vance. I've been informed that speculation exists regarding my involvement in his death. I want to state clearly and unequivocally, I did not kill Theodore Vance. And I did not pay him to manipulate the consolidated merger. Then who did? I believe I know. But before I explain, I need to ask a question. He turned to Patricia Hollis. Miss Hollis, you mentioned that Philip Drexel received a letter from Vance on October 10th that disturbed him greatly. I think I know what that letter contained, because I received one too. The room went absolutely still. Wolfe leaned forward. Slightly explain. Halpern reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. Theodore Vance sent me this letter, dated October 9th. It arrived at my office on October 10th. In it, Vance claims that Philip Drexel paid him $5 million to manipulate the merger. But he also says something else, something that changes everything. He handed the letter to Wolfe. Wolfe read it in silence, his face impassive. Then he passed it to me. I read, Mr. Halpern, I am writing to inform you of a serious fraud perpetrated during the Consolidated Dynamics merger. Philip Drexel, chief counsel for Hartwell Industries, paid me $5 million to provide misleading financial analysis to your board members, George Brennan and Iris Carmichael. However, I have recently discovered that Mr. Drexel did not act alone. He was working in cooperation with someone inside, Consolidated someone, who stood to benefit enormously from ensuring the merger proceeded at Hartwell's price rather than a higher valuation. I don't know who this person is, but I have reason to believe they may have been the one who actually arranged the payment through offshore accounts. Mr. Drexel. This may have been merely the intermediary. I am sending similar letters to several parties involved in the transaction. My purpose is not blackmail, but self-preservation. Something happens to me. These letters will serve as evidence that multiple people had motive to silence me. I realize this information comes too late to affect the merger, but I believe you deserve to know that your company was sold under false pretenses and that someone you trusted betrayed you. Theodore Vance. October 9th, 1951, I looked up at Wolfe. His eyes were closed. His face settled into an expression of profound concentration. Finally, he opened his eyes and said, "Mr. Halpern, who else received these letters?" "I don't know. Vance doesn't say. But I suspect everyone involved in the transaction, board members, executives, possibly even Mrs. Vance." Wolfe turned to Mrs. Vance. "Did you receive such a letter?" She nodded slowly, her face pale. "Yes. It arrived on October 11th. Theodore didn't tell me about it directly. I found it in his study after his death, along with a copy he'd apparently kept for his files. That's one reason I came to you, Mr. Wolfe. I suspected Theodore was involved in something dangerous, but I didn't understand what. Why didn't you mention this letter before? Because I didn't know if it was true. Theodore could have been paranoid or mistaken, or she stopped. I didn't want to accuse anyone without proof." Wolfe was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we now understand what happened. Theodore Vance, feeling trapped and frightened, sent letters to everyone involved in the consolidated merger. His goal was self-preservation. He believed that if multiple people knew about the corruption, no single person would dare kill him for fear of being the obvious suspect. But someone killed him anyway," Kramer said. "Yes, because that someone realized Vance had made a critical error in his strategy. He'd sent letters accusing Philip Drexel of orchestrating the fraud, while suggesting an unknown insider was the actual mastermind. This created confusion, multiple potential suspects, multiple possible motives. The murderer saw an opportunity. What opportunity?" Wolfe's eyes opened fully, and there was something almost sad in his expression. The opportunity to kill Theodore Vance and let everyone else suspect each other. The opportunity to hide in plain sight while the investigation focused on Drexel, on Halpern, on anyone except the person who actually pulled the trigger. He turned to face one specific person in the room. "The opportunity," he said quietly, "that you took, Miss Hollis." The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia Hollis sat frozen in her chair, her face drained of color. Every eye in the room turned to her. "That's insane," she said, but her voice was thin, reedy. "I didn't even know. Theodore Vance. I never went to his house." "I couldn't have, on the contrary," Wolfe said. "You knew him quite well. You'd worked with him for years in your capacity as Philip Drexel's assistant. Every major transaction Hartwell Industries conducted involved coordination between Drexel's office and the financial advisors. You spoke with Theodore Vance, dozens of times. You had his home address, his phone number, his schedule. You knew his habits. That doesn't mean I killed him." "No, but several other facts do. First, consider the timeline. You claim that Philip Drexel discovered Vance's fraud on October 7th during a routine review, but that's impossible. Why? It's because the discrepancies Drexel supposedly found, the omitted contracts, the pessimistic projections would have been obvious to any competent analyst during the transaction itself, not weeks later. Philip Drexel is, by all accounts, meticulous. He would have caught such errors immediately, not after the deal closed." Patricia Hollis's hands tightened in her lap. "You're wrong. Da-da-da-da-da-da. The review process is standard procedure, yes. But it's designed to catch minor oversights, not major fraud. The kind of manipulation Vance engaged in would have been apparent to anyone actually examining his work, which means Drexel didn't discover it on October 7th. He discovered it much earlier, perhaps even before the merger was finalized." Kramer leaned forward. "Are you saying Drexel knew about the fraud and allowed it to proceed?" "No. I'm saying Drexel never knew about the fraud at all, because the person who discovered it wasn't Philip Drexel. It was his assistant, the woman who actually handled the documentation, filed the reports, processed the paperwork, the woman who saw everything that crossed her employer's desk." Wolfe's gaze fixed on Patricia Hollis with surgical precision. "You discovered Vance's fraud in early September, didn't you, Miss Hollis? While preparing merger documents, you noticed the discrepancies in his analysis. And instead of reporting it to Mr. Drexel immediately, you saw an opportunity. What opportunity?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "The The opportunity to profit from silence. You contacted Theodore Vance privately, told him you'd discovered high fraud, and you offered him a choice: pay you to remain silent or face exposure and ruin. That's a lie, is it? Then explain the $5 million. We know it didn't come from Philip Drexel. His accounts show no such payment. We know it came from a shell corporation called Consolidated Holdings. But who established that corporation? Paused, letting the question hang. You did, Miss Hollis. Using information you'd gathered from 12 years of handling Philip Drexel's confidential matters, you knew how to establish offshore entities. You knew how to move money without leaving obvious trails. You'd watched your employer do it dozens of times for legitimate purposes, and you used that knowledge to create a payment mechanism that couldn't easily be traced back to you. Examine Miss Hollis's personal bank accounts from the past 3 months. I believe you'll find that she made several unusual deposits, small amounts, carefully structured to avoid attention, but deposits nonetheless. Money she was skimming from the $5 million she was extracting from Theodore Vance. I never took his money. Then where did the $5 million come from? Someone paid Vance. Someone with access to corporate services firms, offshore banking knowledge, and intimate familiarity with a consolidated merger. Someone who could create a shell creation, transfer funds, and ensure the payment appeared legitimate. Wolfe's voice hardened. You, Miss Hollis. You blackmailed Theodore Vance. You demanded $5 million in exchange for your silence about his fraud. And when he couldn't pay it all immediately, when he became desperate and frightened you, decided he was too dangerous to let live. No, her voice cracked. That's not what happened. Then tell us what did happen. Patricia Hollis's face was white as paper. Cell confronted him, the real confrontation, the one I told Mr. Drexel to make Theodore panicked. He wrote those letters. He was going to expose everything, including me. The room was absolutely silent. Tea from her. Do you understand? What would have happened if he'd confessed? I'd have gone to prison. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, gone. Because of one mistake. One moment of weakness. Weakness, Wolfe repeated. You call extorting $5 million a moment of weakness? Too closely. So I told him to confront Vance. 2. Threaten him with exposure. To create confusion, Wolfe said. To make it appear that Drexel was involved, so suspicion wouldn't fall entirely on Vance. Yes, but Theodore panicked. He wrote that confession naming Mr. Drexel. He sent letters to everyone. He was going to destroy everything, expose the fraud. Implicate Mr. Drexel. Probably expose me too, once the investigation started digging. So on the night of October 13th, you went to his house. Patricia Hollis nodded slowly, her eyes distant, reliving it. I knew the security code. Theodore had given it to me weeks earlier when we were setting up the payments. He said if there was an emergency, I might need to reach him, and let myself. In around 1 a.m., the house was dark. I went to his study. He was working, drinking scotch. When he saw me, he knew why I had come. He didn't resist. He was too drunk, too defeated. He just sat there and said, "Get it over with." Like he'd been waiting for it. Her voice was hollow. I took his wife's gun from her nightstand. I'd seen it weeks earlier when I was there for a meeting. Theodore showed me around the house. I went back to the study and shot him. Once, through the heart. Then I wiped my fingerprints off the gun and placed it near his chair. I left the way I came, reset the security system, and went home. And the next morning, when you heard about his death, I was terrified, but I'd been careful. I knew there was no evidence connecting me to his house that night. No witnesses. No physical trace. I thought if I just stayed quiet, if I kept working for Mr. Drexel normally, no one would suspect me. You didn't count on Vance's confession in the safety deposit box. No. I thought he'd kept all his documentation at home, where I could have accessed it if necessary. I didn't know he'd put copies in a bank. She looked at Wolfe, her eyes hollow. How did you know it was me? Several things, Wolfe said. First, the $5 million had to come from someone with sophisticated knowledge of offshore banking and corporate structures. Not a businessman like Drexel or Halpern would delegate such tasks. but someone who actually handled the mechanics of such transactions, someone like you. Second, the letter Vance sent to Philip Drexel on October 10th. You said it disturbed him greatly, made him lock it away, and behave strangely. But consider, if that letter accused Drexel of paying Vance $5 million, an accusation Drexel knew was false, would he be disturbed? He'd be angry, certainly, outraged at the false accusation, but not frightened, not shaken, unless... Unless what? Unless the letter contained something else, something true, something that actually implicated him not in the bribery, but in creating the circumstances that made the bribery possible. What did that letter really say, Miss Hollis? She was quiet for a moment. Then it said Mr. Drexel had been careless in his supervision of the consolidated merger, that he'd failed to catch obvious fraud because he'd delegated too much responsibility to me, that his negligence made him partially culpable for what had happened. Theodore was trying to spread the blame, to make everyone look guilty so no one would look too closely at any single person, including himself, and including you. Clever, but it failed because Theodore Vance underestimated how desperate you were. He thought sending letters to everyone would protect him. Instead, it merely confirmed that he'd become an intolerable risk. Wolfe turned to Inspector Kramer. Inspector, I believe you have enough for an arrest. Miss Hollis has confessed to murder, blackmail, and fraud. The details can be sorted out in due course, but the essential facts are clear. Kramer stood, his face grim, and moved toward Patricia Hollis. She didn't resist as he took her arm. She seemed almost relieved, as if the burden of concealment had finally become too heavy to bear. One question, she said as Kramer led her toward the door. How much of this did you know before I confessed? How much was guesswork? Wolfe regarded her with something approaching sympathy. Until you spoke, I had 3 equally plausible theories. But your reaction when I accused Eutha, immediate denial followed by defensive justification, told me everything I needed to know. Guilty people deny, innocent people express outrage. You did both, in precisely the wrong order. She smiled faintly, bitterly. 12 years of watching brilliant men negotiate and strategize, and I still couldn't lie convincingly when it mattered. That, Wolfe said, is because lying successfully requires belief in one's own righteousness. You know you're guilty, Miss Hollis. You've known it since the moment you pulled that trigger. And guilt, however deeply buried, always reveals itself eventually. Kramer took her out. The remaining guests sat in stunned silence. Finally, Richard Halpern said, Mr. Wolfe, I owe you an apology. When Mrs. Vance suggested we come here this morning, I was skeptical. I thought this was a waste of time, but you've done remarkable work. I've done what I was hired to do, Wolfe said. Nothing more. Mrs. Vance stood, her face composed, but her eyes wet. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. You've cleared my name and found my husband's killer. I'm grateful. Don't be grateful yet, madam. Your husband was a corrupt man who sold his professional integrity for money. That he was murdered doesn't absolve him of his crimes. I know, but at least now I understand what happened. It's worth something. After the others had filed out Halpern, Brennan, Carmichael Stoddard, each lost in their own thoughts about corruption and murder, I sat at my desk and looked at Wolfe. So I said, how much of that did you actually know before she confessed? Reached for his beer. Approximately 40%. The offshore accounts, the blackmail scheme, the mode of those I'd deduced from the facts. But the specific details of the murder, her access to the house, the exact sequence of events, those emerged only when she spoke. You took a hell of a risk accusing her without proof. Not a risk, a calculated gamble. I knew the murderer was someone who understood offshore banking, who had access to corporate formation services, who knew the Vance household well enough to bypass security and locate Mrs. Vance's gun. Miss Hollis fit all those criteria. And when she reacted as she did, denying first, then justifying, I knew I was correct. What if you'd been wrong? Then I would have apologized and pursued a different theory. But I wasn't wrong. The guilty reveal themselves, Archie? Always. Sometimes through action, sometimes through speech, but always through some betrayal of their inner knowledge that they've transgressed. He drained his beer and set down the glass with finality. Now go tell. Fritz, we'll have lunch in 30 minutes. I've had quite enough of murder for one morning. This afternoon I have orchids to attend to, and this evening I'll have beer and a book. The world may continue its parade of corruption and violence, but for the next 12 hours, I intend to ignore it entirely. What about Mrs. Vance?
Don't!
We need to discuss the fee. Send her a bill for $10,000 plus expenses. She paid the retainer, we earned it. The transaction is complete. And Philip Drexel. He was arrested for a crime he didn't commit. He'll be released within the hour once Kramer processes Miss Hollis's confession. The wheels of justice, however rusty, still occasionally function. Wolfe's eyes closed. Any other questions? It's just 1. The confession in the safety deposit box Vance claimed Drexel paid him $5 million, but that was a lie. Why would Vance lie in a confession meant to protect him? 'Cause Vance was a coward and a fool. He thought if he named Drexel a powerful attorney with resources and connections, it would create enough confusion to protect him from the actual blackmailer. We gambled that Drexel would be too busy defending himself to look closely at who else might have motive to kill him. It was a gamble Vance lost. And the letter Drexel received on October 10th. What did it really say? Exactly what Miss Hollis claimed? Vance accused Drexel of negligence in supervising the merger. He was spreading blame as widely as possible, hoping to muddy the waters enough that no single person could act against him with impunity. It was clever in theory. In practice, it merely ensured that multiple people had reason to want him dead. Wolfe shifted in his chair, a sign that the conversation was over. Now go, Archie. Tell Fritz about lunch. Open a bottle of Rimmer's. To accompany at the murder of Theodore Vance deserves at least a decent beer. I stood and headed for the kitchen, grinning. Another case closed, another murderer caught, another demonstration of Wolfe's ability to see through lies and facades to the ugly truth underneath. Behind me, I heard Wolfe murmur to himself, $5 million. The woman murdered a man for $5 million. As if money could purchase anything worth having, anything beyond beer, food, and the cultivation of Cattleya hybrids. Mankind's stupidity is exceeded only by its capacity for self-delusion. I didn't argue. My experience, Wolfe was usually right about human nature, Evan, when he was being insufferably superior about it. 3 days later, on a crisp October afternoon, I was at my desk sorting through mail when Mrs. Vance called. Her voice was stronger now, more composed. Mr. Goodwin, I wanted to let you know that the estate proceedings are moving forward. I'll be selling the Riverside Drive house to many bad memories. And I've established a fund in Theodore's name to support ethics education and finance programs. It seems ... appropriate. That's generous of you. It's necessary. Theodore made terrible choices, but he also paid for them with his life. The least I can do is try to ensure other young professionals don't make the same mistakes. She paused. Please thank Mr. Wolfe for me. He could have simply collected his fee and walked away. Instead, he gave me answers. That matters more than I can say. After she hung up, I relayed the message to Wolfe. He grunted, not looking up from his book. The woman's conscience troubles her. She married a corrupt man and benefited from his corruption for years. Now she seeks absolution through charitable gestures. How tediously predictable. Maybe she just wants to do something good, perhaps. Or perhaps she simply wants to sleep better at night. The two are rarely the same thing. He turned to Paige. Any other calls? Saul wants to know if you need him this week. No. Fred needs a recommendation for another client. Tell him to mention my name. That should suffice. And Inspector Kramer wants to know if you'll testify at Patricia Hollis's trial? Wolfe's eyes closed in pain. Tell him no. My testimony is a matter of record. The district attorney cannot convict on the evidence available. That's his inadequacy, not mine. I will not waste days sitting in a courtroom watching lawyers perform their theatrical rituals. He'll subpoena you. Then I'll ignore it and pay whatever contempt fine the judge imposes. It will cost less than the time wasted. I grinned and made notes. Standard Wolfe, brilliant at solving murders, Allergic to their legal aftermath, the doorbell rang. I answered it to find a delivery man with a package. Inside was a case of Remmer's beer and a note from Lawrence Stoddard. Mr. Wolfe, thank you for uncovering the truth about Theodore's death and clearing the firm's name. I've closed Vance and Stoddard and am starting fresh under a new partnership. We'll do better this time. The beer is inadequate compensation, but it's offered with genuine gratitude. Minus LS. I brought the note to Wolfe. He read it and set it aside. The man shows sense. Beer is always appropriate compensation. He glanced at the case. Put it in the cellar. We'll drink it when this current supply runs low. Anything else? Yes. Stop hovering. I'm reading. Go find something useful to do. I returned to my desk and picked up the Times. The Hollis case had made the front page. Secretary turned blackmailer confesses to murder. The article detailed the offshore accounts, the blackmail scheme, the midnight shooting. Patricia Hollis was being held without bail, facing charges of murder, extortion, and fraud. Her trial was scheduled for January. Philip Drexel had been exonerated and released. He'd given a statement expressing shock and betrayal at his assistant's actions. He'd worked with her for 12 years and never suspected a thing. The article noted he was taking a leave of absence from Hartwell Industries to recover from this ordeal. I wondered if he'd recover from the knowledge that the woman he'd trusted had used his access and his connections to commit murder. Probably men like Drexel were resilient. They had to be. The Consolidated Dynamics merger was being reviewed. By the SEC, George Brennan and Iris Carmichael were cooperating with investigators, claiming they'd been victims of fraud. Richard Halpern was facing questions about whether he'd known about Vance's manipulations. The whole thing was a mess that would take years to untangle. And through it all, Nero Wolfe sat in his office, reading about orchids and drinking beer, utterly indifferent to the chaos he'd helped create by exposing the truth. I set down the paper and looked at him, a seventh of a ton of genius arranged behind a desk. Solving murders without leaving his chair, seeing through lies without breaking. A sweat, I said. Sometimes I think you enjoy this. It's the murder, the investigation, the unmasking of killers. You complain about it, but you enjoy it. Wolfe didn't look up from his book. I enjoy intellectual puzzles, Archie. That murder provides them is merely an unfortunate coincidence. If orchid cultivation required the same level of deductive reasoning, I'd never leave the plant rooms. But it doesn't. No, orchids, unlike humans, behave according to predictable patterns. They respond rationally to proper care. They don't lie, cheat, murder, or delude themselves about their own nature, which is why they're infinitely superior to our species. And yet you keep solving human problems because someone must, and because you continue bringing them to my attention despite my objections. You mean like Mrs. Vance? It's the one you refused to see until I pointed out the money? Wolfe's eyes opened, and he fixed me with a look of profound irritation. Archie, stop chattering. You've made your point. Now either find something productive to do or leave me in peace. I'm reading about Phalaenopsis scilariana hybridization techniques, and your commentary is interfering with my concentration. Grinned and turned back to my work. Outside, the October afternoon faded into evening. The brownstone on West 35th Street settled into its familiar rhythms. Fritz in the kitchen preparing dinner. Wolfe in his chair reading about orchids. Me at my desk organizing files and making notes. Another case closed. Another murderer caught. Another demonstration that human nature, however corrupt and self-destructive, always reveals itself to those patient enough to watch and clever enough to understand. Nero Wolfe had done it again, and tomorrow, when some new client rang the doorbell with some new problem, he'd complain bitterly about the interruption right up until the moment. His curiosity got the better of him, and he started asking questions. Because for all his talk about preferring orchids to humans, Nero Wolfe couldn't resist a good puzzle, and murder, however distasteful, always provided the best puzzles of all. The end.